Hello, everybody, and welcome back to week 3 of online learning. I'm so excited to be back and to continue with our Texas in the Civil War unit here in social studies. So last time we talked about the Civil War, and now we're going to focus specifically on former President Abraham Lincoln, who was president during the Civil War. So our social studies joke of the day, the picture of President Lincoln saying, "Go to the theater," they said. "It'll be fun," they said, which is ironic because he was shot and killed in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So, okay. Do now. Write 2 to 3 impacts of the Civil War on Texas on a piece of paper. Remember, we talked about it last week. We talked about how there were blockades and how Texas, obviously, as a member of the Confederate States of America, sent soldiers to fight. So what were 2 to 3 impacts of the Civil War on Texas? Write it on a piece of paper. Of course, pause the video if you need to, and go. I'm going to keep going, but again, pause the video if you need to. So our TEK for today, 4.4a, the student understands the political, economic, and social changes in Texas during the last half of the 19th century. The student is expected to describe the impact of the Civil War on Texas. So within that TEK, our objective today is the learner will identify 3 ways that Abraham Lincoln, like you want to bring it across like he's wearing a top hat, Abraham Lincoln impacted the United States of America. So we're going to be talking about Abraham Lincoln, and we're going to talk about 3 ways that he impacted the United States of America through his presidency and leadership. So just a little bit of background, a biography about him. He was born on February 12, 1809 in a cabin in Kentucky. He was known as Honest Abe. When Abe was 9 years old, his mother died, but his father eventually remarried. And although it's not directly credited to her, it is believed by many scholars that Abe's stepmom is the one who encouraged him to read, because as a child, he loved to read. He ran for state legislature, so his state's Congress, but he lost his first election and never lost after that. He began to practice law in 1836, and then on November 4th, 1842, he married Mary Todd, and eventually would have 4 sons, Edward, William, Robert, and Thomas. And then in November of 1860, he was elected president, and then was finally assassinated on April 15th, 1865, in Washington, D.C. By a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor who had Confederate sympathies, meaning that he was sympathetic to the Confederate cause, and Lincoln was working in direct opposition to the Confederate cause. So, more about his presidency. Again, he's elected in November of 1860. He is the 16th president of the United States. So we're on number 45 right now. So just to give you an idea of how many presidents have passed between him and our current president. So he was elected president in November of 1860. However, the country was already split into the Union and the Confederacy before he even stepped foot in the White House. During the Civil War, he had practical and flexible leadership. So he wasn't someone who would plan things extensively, right? He was more in the moment as he needed to. He would make adjustments to different policies, strategies, etc., which actually really benefited him during the Civil War and throughout, which, took up most of his presidency. He personally was devoted to personal freedom and in halting the spread of slavery, but was reluctant to adopt an abolitionist policy, meaning he was reluctant to actually abolish slavery. He wanted to halt the spread. Back then, in the United States, we had certain states, but we also had territories, right? And that was and whether or not slavery was allowed in these territories was a point of contention that people would often argue about. So he didn't want slavery in the territories, but as I said, he was hesitant to abolish slavery in the entire country because he was concerned about the political consequences, meaning, one of the consequences did play out in the Civil War, or the war between the states, with the Confederacy forming. And he was also concerned about the social consequences, how to reintegrate all these slaves into society. Whether it's right or wrong is up to your own evaluation, but that was what he was concerned about. So in 1863, he eventually did issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which effectively ended slavery in the states. However, since the Confederacy was still their own self-proclaimed country, their laws did not follow the Emancipation Proclamation. However, once the South surrendered in 1864, the 13th Amendment ended slavery for good. So in all states and in the Confederacy. The biggest thing during Abraham Lincoln's presidency is that he preserved the Union during the Civil War, and he kept the country together, as well as emancipating slaves in the states. So we're going to watch a short video.
Today we're going to learn about the American president, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was born February 12, 1809, in Kentucky. His father was a farmer, and his family was very poor, living in a small, one-room log cabin. While Lincoln was still very young, his family moved to Indiana, and then again to Illinois. He only went to school for 1 year, but he loved books and learning and taught himself as much as he could. When he was 22 years old, Abraham Lincoln left home to work at a general store. It was there that he got his nickname, Honest Abe. Once a customer accidentally overpaid by a few pennies, and that night, when the store closed, Abraham Lincoln walked for miles to take the money back. In 1832, Lincoln ran in an election to become a member of the Illinois state legislature, but he lost. After that, he served as a captain in the army, and then he started working as a lawyer and got married. In 1846, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1860, he ran for president. It was a difficult time in the United States. The North and the South disagreed on a lot of things, and it was getting worse. One thing they disagreed on was slavery. The northern states did not want any more slavery. The southern states wanted to keep their slaves. Abraham Lincoln did not like slavery either. He was elected president because he had the support of the northern states. He had almost no support from the southern states. As soon as he became president, southern states began seceding from the Union. That means they decided they didn't want to be part of the United States anymore. President Lincoln was determined to keep the country together, and in 1861, a war started. It was the Civil War, a terrible, bloody war that lasted 4 years. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, an order that freed all the slaves in the southern states. A few years later, he helped to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which made slavery illegal everywhere in the United States. The Civil War finally ended on April 9th, 1865. President Lincoln wanted to put the country back together and help the South rebuild. Unfortunately, he did not live to see that happen. Less than a week after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln and his wife were watching a play at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., when he was shot in the head by a man named John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln died the next morning, on April 15th, 1865. He was the first American president to be assassinated. Abraham Lincoln once said, "I want it said of me by those who knew me best, that I always plucked a thistle and planted a flower where I thought a flower would grow. He is widely considered to be one of the greatest presidents in American history. His leadership during the Civil War and his defense of human liberty make him an American hero. His face is on pennies and $5 bills. He was included in Mount Rushmore, and a memorial for him stands in Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoyed learning about Abraham Lincoln. Goodbye till next time.
Abraham Lincoln, what are his impacts today? So, we've already talked about this so much. He preserved the country. That's huge. Without his influence and with any weaker leader, our country's geography may not look the same today. He effectively ended slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation, followed by the 13th Amendment. And he proved the value of our democracy. Now, what does that mean? Now, whenever he was in his presidency, he used executive powers and was able to justly go about being a wartime president using the values of our democracy and the different mechanisms that exist in our democracy. So he basically reaffirmed that the way our democracy is set up today is effective and does work. So where else do we see him today? The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was dedicated in 1992. We see him on the $5 bill and on pennies. And last but not least, we see him in the sculpture of Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. So our job today was to identify 3 ways that Abraham Lincoln impacted the United States of America. So he preserved our democracy. He preserved our country, he proved the value of our democracy, and he effectively ended slavery. Those 3 impacts make him one of the most impactful and influential presidents of our history. So, now, don't forget to complete the MOL. It's in Google Forms. This is what is graded. Then, for your assignment, you're going to go on to Achieve. In your Social Studies tab, the lesson is Civil War, Lincoln wore that. You have 7 vocabulary words here on this PowerPoint. Please review them before you complete the assignment. Then we have the before reading poll. So the Smithsonian Museum is showing things from Abraham Lincoln's life. People can see things like his top hat, which he was famous for, his black suit, and his family pictures. What do you think about this? So, do you think that a museum is the best way to learn about an important person's life? Do you agree or disagree? And then tell me why you agreed or disagreed. You have to complete Stop and Jots, your after reading poll, and the math activity. Optionally, you can complete the stretch article and activity and the thought question. Then for your extension activity, this is actually something that I did when I was in 4th grade. So, legend has it that Abraham Lincoln spoke his famous Gettysburg Address in exactly 2 minutes. Search on the internet for the script of the Gettysburg Address and film yourself giving the address. Read it through a couple of times before you film yourself so that you're familiar with the words. You can also use your script while you film yourself. So submit a video of yourself reading the address, and whoever can read the address in the closest time to 2 minutes long will receive a prize from me. If you can, submit it in Google Classrooms. If not, send the video to me at the number listed here, 469-616-1475. And if you are the winner, I will make sure to message you and get your address so I can mail it to you. Alright guys, I hope that you have learned more about the Civil War and about one of our most esteemed presidents, and I will see you next week in Social Studies. Bye everyone!